Good. I think we're in. Let's have a look. Does it say on your screen there? Excellent. I'm just going to check on here, as I always do. Yeah, we're in. Oh my God. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Andy.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us in the group today. Sorry, we're a few minutes late, everybody. Me and Sarah, we're having a good old yap, as we do. We haven't spoken to each other for ages, have we?
No.
It's funny because just life, it just flies by, especially this last year, I think. It's just kind of a blink, isn't it? And it's just pure.
I think the last 2 years, for me, have been a bit of a time warp. It's made me kind of reframe the whole memory of time. It's quite bizarre.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because we set our stall before, didn't we, on time of having things in the diary and doing certain things and having certain traditions as part of our life and work life. And when that goes, everything just becomes a lot more fluid and a lot more, and not necessarily in a bad way, actually. I think some of it I've actually quite enjoyed. There's been some freedoms from some of the kind of being on the wheel kind of thing that I felt before.
And that's a really important aspect of our amazing connection with canines. I've been thinking about this a lot, that people obviously come on courses or come as a client and they're looking for answers, but for me, I really encourage them to ask more questions. And sometimes we only actually get the answer to a question when something changes. So what we might have perceived as being triggers for fatigue might actually have been linked to quite specific patterns, and we were caught in that pattern loop because patterns help us feel safe and keeps everything familiar. But because those patterns had to change, it certainly gave me the opportunity to reconsider a lot of my belief systems about my own working life. I used to think the evenings, for example, were not creative time for me. I'm certainly more creative really early on in the morning, but I actually discovered I'm not so creative in the evening because I was so tired from driving and loading up the car and connecting and sitting in traffic, of which I'm a part. And actually, when I could strip all that away because I had no choice, I had way more energy in the evening. So it's certainly given me the time to reflect and reevaluate my work schedule moving forward.
And that's a really good point, isn't it? Because this, you mentioned there about your kind of belief system. I talk a bit about our worldviews and how that very much dictates what we see, especially when that quick thinking brain's firing away, that perception. And no, you're right. And I think we can definitely relate that back to dogs. Anyway, right, so we've dived straight in, haven't we? So let's just step back a little bit. Sarah, welcome. So Sarah, could you just start off by telling us a little bit about the wonderful work you do, just to kind of frame things, and just a little bit as we start, because this is something that a lot of the feedback I get, people love to hear about how people navigated their own little journey into what they do. So I know there's a lot to talk about there because you've got a lot there, but yeah, just the first few minutes, if you could just give us a bit of a recap of how you've come to do what you do and then what it is you do now.
Okay. Well, I've been really fortunate to connect with animals for over 25 years. And I always had a passion for animals, crazy about horses. I started riding horses from the age of 4. I connected with my first family dog from the age of 11, but all my family, grandparents on both sides, had dogs. My father was particularly passionate about making sure fresh water was available all the time, and reminding me as even a small child that the animal didn't choose to come to my life. I chose to bring the animal into mine, and therefore I had to put the animal's needs above mine all the time. And one of my grandparents had rescue dogs, and we were taught, again from a really early age, don't look at the dog in the eye, don't stroke the dog, keep that engagement diffused, don't be loud and fast moving around the dogs. So I kind of was lucky that I was brought up with this culture of really understanding the amazing joy that dogs bring, and also how much we need to respect that they've been invited into our space. Another of my relatives, my aunt, her Labrador had known arthritis on the left hip. So again, from as early as I remember, it wasn't even a lesson I remember having to learn. We weren't allowed to touch him there at all. And if he was lying down on his right side, we were to leave him. We weren't to touch him because we would then have run into the potential for stroking him on that sore left hip. So kind of all that was a big part of my upbringing. Always had animals in my life, and then started to train in human massage because a friend of mine's daughter was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer when the little girl was 18 months old. And that sparked a huge shift in basically what I was going to end up doing for the rest of my life. I spent a lot of time at Great Ormond Street Hospital with her. And in the horse world, you were always taught if a horse walked into you, it was a sign of dominance and rudeness. And that never sat right with me. And I remember walking through the corridors at Great Ormond Street Hospital with my friend, and she kept walking into me. And I remember just thinking, how could anyone perceive this behavior as dominance? My friend is so emotionally distraught and destroyed. Her emotional balance is influencing her physical balance. I also recognized during that time that I wanted to look for something I could do for these parents who were sitting by the beds of their children. You couldn't say anything to make them feel better. But what I could offer potentially was going to be body contact, and hopefully non-threatening body contact through light massage. And so that set me off on that path with anatomy and physiology for humans, and also this incredible light massage that I was learning, where the focus was also on that link between emotion and physical well-being. Then one of our horses had an accident, and in searching for possibilities for him, I came across the work of Linda Tellington-Jones, and Linda said something very key for me, that there was a link between posture and behavior. So that completely sort of lit a spark in me, and I started to train in T-touch. It sat really well with what I knew about the nervous system and anatomy and physiology for humans. And that lovely understanding of we should look for possibilities rather than defining something that is good or bad or right or wrong. And through discovering Linda's work, we were able to give our horse quality of life. At 2 years old, I had a question mark whether we were right to keep him alive. He was a big, fast-growing horse, and he damaged his pelvis. And we actually ended up putting him to sleep when he was 28. I believe he lived a fulfilled life with us. I hope that is the case. And through Linda's sort of first observations of that link between posture and behavior, I started to see more and more, and then started to teach the detail of what I was seeing within a T-touch framework, including looking at details in the animal's coats, and again, starting to reframe my belief systems about postural triggers in horses. Let's just take the sort of behavior of spooking for a moment, and thinking, well, it's because the head is high, that engages the sympathetic nervous system, which is true, or certainly is a correlation. And that's what we're looking for, correlation, not causation. And that happens posturally because the saddle doesn't fit. But then I actually started to see that dogs that were tight through the trapezius, hollow in the back, tight through the upper part of the thoracic spine, they were actually also really sensitive to body contact, to sensory information in the external environment. And that was correlating potentially with things that were changing in their internal environment that were driving the postures that I was seeing. Saw the same in sheep, saw the same in cats. And that's for me where having experience with different species hopefully kept those questions coming, because it's quite easy to sort of fill in a backstory because we want answers. Our brain naturally seeks answers, so we can kind of go, got it, move on, keep that brain capacity open for new learning and new input. And if anything, if I've learned anything, it's that I know very little. And I sometimes am introduced as a dog expert or a horse expert. And in my humble opinion, the only experts that exist are the animals themselves. So I'm passionate about helping people be the best caregiver through increased observations and sharing what I've had the good fortune to learn from my amazing animal tutors over 27 years.
That's really interesting. Hearing from it really early on then, thanks to your family, actually.
Yes.
You already had this view of seeing animals beyond that kind of that control coercion framework that a lot of us get brought up with dogs. I know when I was brought up, my grandfather's a big influence on me, sadly. He had a lot to do with the dog racing kind of fraternity, so he had a very fixed view. And actually it was my mother who used to try and correct him, because my mother was a very compassionate, loving lady who didn't know anything about dogs, but she knew about compassion and about, well, maybe we shouldn't be treating dogs like that. And so I had those two cultures, if you like. But I know from my point of view, when I first started thinking about things, and trying to join up actually some of the stuff from my human background, it was having the chance to meet you, and for some of the lovely things you said to me early on about, look, go with that thought, don't disconnect from it, and also the power of good observations. And obviously you had something like Linda as well, and we'll talk about collaborations and connections in a bit, because I think we both agree it's really important that we all open ourselves up, because we're trying to learn about the emotional truth of another species here, and it's going to take more than one voice for sure to look at that. But let's just think about observations for a minute, Sarah, because we were talking off air about how really this comes down to a lot of people who get in touch with me are like, well, okay, this is all, I kind of get this need to maybe think beyond just a training toolbox, but how do we start? And it does start with just slowing down and just trying to do those good observations. And so share with us what you see as being good observations and how those observations should look.
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, when people come on my courses, either in person or online, or come to me as a client, or if I'm teaching in a rescue centre, what I hope I encourage people to do is to recognise that they will be seeing something, and what they are seeing will be correct. It will be right for their brain, the way their brain is processing that information. So there's no wrong observation. What we might then do is add a few more layers, and then they might actually reconsider what they were seeing, or reconsider their interpretation of what they're seeing. But I really encourage people just to stick to what they see. So we start by maybe picking the dog's ear set, or maybe the position of the tail, maybe how the dog organizes his body when he's standing. Can he distribute weight evenly over 4 legs? Or are we starting to see moments where there may be some degree of balance, but then that right leg, perhaps the right hind, suddenly pops out to the side? I encourage people to keep looking, because we may have just captured a moment in time if we're just looking at a photograph. So again, it is looking for patterns, because postural patterns are in place from a really early age. But through the courses, or via email, I encourage people to go back over photographs they might have already captured if they're living with an adult dog perhaps, and look at the sit, the rest position when the dog's lying down. Look at the movement when the dog's maybe being videoed just in the garden or off leash out in a park. Start looking for patterns. That's all we want people to be able to identify. But I want to try and keep it as simple as possible for people too. So sometimes just looking at the tail, or maybe how many repetitions are there where the dog turns to the left versus when the dog turns his head to the right. For example, someone shared a video of their dog sniffing in the park, and it was amazing. When we just said, count how many flexions left, then count how many flexions right. There were no flexions right at all, Andy. The dog only centered to the left, moved to the left, then would come up, reorganize the whole frame to move back towards the caregiver, and then started that centering to the left again. So these patterns, when you actually start to recognize them, can be actually quite evident. Sometimes they're really subtle, and sometimes we only recognize them when the posture of the dog starts to change. So I just say capture, there's no wrong or right, but we can start adding more layers. So what do good observations look like? Do you know what? I'm still learning. So I will never have that answer. I know, I laugh at myself for clocking something in photographs of my current companion, Henry, that I was getting videos, getting photographs ready for one of the courses. And he's always had reduced mobility in the right ear. When he came to me on foster, his right ear couldn't move very much at all. He was overdeveloped in the right side of his neck, super sensitive to contact, particularly through the whole right side of his body, and sensitive to contact everywhere, and on what I would call sensory overload over the course of the 2-week foster period. And then he came back to me. We were unpeeling more and more layers. But this right ear was tighter. When I started to look back through the photographs of that ear position starting to change, I noticed he had more gunk, more room in the corner of his right eye. And I thought, why didn't I notice that? I know this happens with horses that have got restricted mobility through the ear, through that upper part of the neck. You see more gunk in the horse's eye. Why did I never take that knowledge and actually recognize that pattern in dogs? And then I posted about it in one of our groups, and then people started to share photos of their dog saying, my goodness, my mother who caretakes my dog while I'm at work has said my dog's eye's been runny on the right all week, and I've just come back from the physio and she said my dog's really tight through that right shoulder, coming down through the right side of the neck. So it's a thing, it's a potential correlation between restriction of soft tissue on that same side where you see more gunk. So yeah, keep looking, keep learning, and just trust what your body or your brain is telling you you're seeing. But then keep that question mark. We don't want to go, oh yes, I've seen that. That's how it is all the time, because we actually don't know. But there are patterns to everything. And it is for me about joining dots and then hopefully adding some color to, but remembering to keep question everything. Do we then recognize a new pattern, or is the pattern old, but we've only just started to recognize it? So again, it's that just keep noting, keep being the best dog detective you can be, stand back, do less and watch more, and slow down the engagement for your dog, slow down for you if it's possible as well. But it isn't always possible because of what's going on for us in our own bodies, our own nervous systems. So yeah, that's a really interesting question. What do good observations look like? For me, if you recognize you live with the best dog in the world and your dog is a beautiful black sighthound, for example, that's a good observation. And then we can start looking for more detail.
But even that, even everything you just said there, I'm sorry, every time I look down, I'm making notes because you're saying so many wonderful things. And I think this is the thing about good observations, it's about being present. And this is a big thing for me, a big shift that I've done over the years, especially because of free work. We're going to talk about free work in a minute because, oh my God, I love it. And it's made a huge difference to how I practice and how I work and how I do my observations. But more traditionally, we think, oh yeah, so the dog has I'm talking from a behavioral training point of view, you know, the dog has a response to something, and that's why we've been brought in. And the first thing is to put the dog and see what that response is.
Yeah.
But actually, we learn very little from that, really. A lot of people ask me, why do I see the dog on its own without seeing, for example, the dog around the dog in that first session or even a couple of sessions? Because of all these little nuances, not just from a physical point of view, but from a brain processing point of view. You know, good old Laura Donaldson, who talks a lot about cognitive reappraisal, and these are all the lovely bits of the jigsaw there where multiple voices coming together to show this stuff. But we also, you could touched on it there, and about recognizing our own elevation, our own state, and recognizing to be really present is actually quite hard. It takes practice because, and then to keep reevaluating. So it's like, yeah, question mark. Oh, we've seen a few of those things now that makes me think that might be a thing, but then still being able to come back and put a question mark over it as we build that picture up. And that's the essence, isn't it?
Sorry, yes, absolutely. Just had really nice, feedback from the few students we just finished teaching for the year on how we've either been able to support them in seeking some answers to some of the questions they've been asking for a while, or we've been able to help guide their observations and recognize postural patterns that actually did warrant further veterinary investigation. So people have been sending x-rays saying, we found it. Well, we found something, because within that, obviously, the body's now adapted and compensated. And that's how brilliant all bodies are, not just dogs. The human body compensates. And it's only when those kind of compensation patterns run out that the original source of the problem or problems might become more evident to us. But again, for me, the observations are just about being present with our dogs, but also being able to identify these subtle shifts and keep those question marks, let's say, around some common behavior challenges for some guardians, such as pulling on the lead, question mark. Is your lead too short? Is your lead too heavy? Is the equipment you're using, such as the harness or maybe a flat collar, inhibiting the movement of the dog? Some dogs, when you take their collar off, gain such freedom of movement through the shoulder and the neck. It's almost like night and day. Is your dog pulling because he's actually tipping out of balance because his hind legs are growing during adolescence at a faster rate than the long bones in the foreleg? Is your dog pulling and seem keen because he's actually trying to avoid something? Is the dog trying to offload uncomfortable joints? Is he moving quickly? Because the body seeks movement where there's pain. And this is, again, isn't just the canine body, it's the human body. And you don't even need to be suffering acute pain to recognize the need to move when your body's trying to reset and heal from something that might have caused some inflammatory response, such as surgery. People now know the benefits of getting patients up almost immediately post-surgery, because movement is healing. But we need to look at the quality of that movement. Is it efficient? Is the dog able to move fluidly in balance through a wide range of natural movement patterns? Or is the dog stuck in one pattern of moving quickly, maybe always in trot, for example, because there's a quick offload of painful joints, or because the dog emotionally doesn't feel safe in the outside world? So when we talk about keenness and high drive, I always say, question mark, have we got busy brain or body pain? Sometimes we have both.
And these are important because one of the big things I learned from you early on was to really start questioning a lot of the behavioral challenges, issues about whether or not we are actually, through not understanding our dog's movement and their movement needs, understanding our dog's decompression needs, that we're actually creating the problems that then we have to try and fix afterwards. So pulling's a really big one for me. And I think, like take with Molly, our rescue pup, we've not done any loose leash walking with her because we haven't needed to, because we've really slowed stuff down and given her the chance to process and mooch and move. And if I do feel that kind of tension through the leash, I know she's elevating a little bit. And it's just kind of recognizing these things. There's a lot of things I know that we've discussed before about some of the things that go on in, especially for adolescent dogs. We can come on to adolescent dogs in a moment, that we see as being an issue because they're adolescents. But actually, if we step back, is it actually what we're doing, the priorities we have for adolescent dogs, that are creating the issues?
I love you. You're amazing. Yes. Again, we need to kind of take on board, you know, what other people have shared from experience, but keep question marks, question everything I'm saying as well. Because one of the belief systems certainly used to be, I don't know if it still is adolescent dogs need more socialization and more training. And when they put on the brakes, which adolescent dogs do, it's a really normal behavior. And that to me is a dog utterly overwhelmed. Don't use food because they'll change, stopping with moving forward. And I'm like, wait, that is not my experience. My experience is that many adolescent dogs need their world shrinking. It doesn't mean we're not going to give them with learning opportunities, because dogs love to learn. But we're going to keep that learning on us in a safe and familiar environment. And if I need to use food to motivate an adolescent dog to move, Why aren't I going to use that in the short term whilst I recognise or try to recognise what I did to inadvertently overload that youngster, so he had to put on the brake? And if my adolescent dog isn't motivated to move for anything other than food, why? What is it that I can change in terms of equipment that I might be using, the area that I walked in? What happens when I maybe take him back home? What was happening before we even left the property? What was his response to me reaching out to put on the lead? You know, the more we can question, the more we can recognize what these incredible dogs can teach us rather than what we believe we're going to teach them. So I've always had, you know, a lot of question marks around some of the probably very, you know, well-intentioned advice online, because it certainly didn't fit with what I was actually seeing from these incredible canine tutors. So keep questioning.
And that's really important, isn't it? Because I think there's a lot of perceived wisdoms that have gone without challenge for a long time, because with a lot of things regarding belief systems, we hear it as being the truth, because that's what we read in the book, that's what we saw on the TV show, that's what we heard at that seminar, whatever. I think what's at the heart of this way of thinking, which you've been talking about for a long time, Sarah, I think you're definitely one of the authentic voices here, because you've been talking about this for a long time. It's now very much people are really starting to think, actually, yeah, I can get that now. Which is the problem with some of these perceived wisdoms, is we haven't actually asked the dog, in the case of dogs, or we haven't actually sort of seen what we actually do see without putting it through that filter, which is already telling us that it must be something else. And this thing about adolescent dogs, especially because we've got such a great supportive community of people sharing their wisdoms, you know, people like Amber Batson, Kathy Murphy and others talking about what's going on neurologically and physiologically for these dogs going through adolescence. Just like with us humans, it's hard for them. And the abilities to kind of be able to have that cognitive reappraisal that Laura Donaldson talks about is very difficult for adolescent dogs. There's a lot of pressures put on them. And if that wasn't enough for them from what already physiologically and neurologically is going on, our more traditional, which is still the norm, which is that good to bad continuum of behavior, we're going to train the dog to do something because that's what we need. It's just an extra pressure. It's no wonder so many of these dogs end up in the rescue. I think it's something like 40% of dogs that end up in rescue are adolescent dogs. And and that's because they're misunderstood by the caregivers in the first place, because they've been sold a notion of you must train, you must get an obedient dog, and if not, somehow that dog's failing. And it's a shame.
Sorry. But there's not so much information out there, although, like you say, voices are gathering, voices are becoming more accessible. And years ago, Vicky Stillwell, amazing Vicky, asked me to do a presentation on the adolescent dog for one of the in-person dog behavior conferences. So I was it's my favorite age group. It's the age group that has taught me the most. It's adolescent dogs that probably are the founders of ACE. I'm just the translator, if you like. And I was looking around to see what available information was there for caregivers who maybe first-time caregivers, maybe they have some experience. And a big website, I'm not going to name and shame, that's not my MO at all, but a popular website where people would go, and they'd be right to go there because a lot of the information was so sound, was on how to select your puppy, how to select a great education provider for your puppy, not to use punishment, how to help with house training, and the paragraphs, you know, went through sort of every aspect of puppy guardianship. And I was thinking, oh, this is really great, can't wait to get to adolescence. It can be a challenging phase for some dogs and their owners, don't worry, soon passes. Adult dogs, and I'm like, what? 2 sentences? Adolescence can start for some youngsters around 4 months of age. It can continue up to 2.5. I certainly see, and I think we should start talking about adolescence in 3 different phases, kind of 5 to 9 months, 9 to 18 months, 18 to 24 months. We know with humans that the maturity doesn't really occur now till much later than originally thought. I think we're going to find the same with dogs. That's certainly my experience as well. And I was quite amazed at how little information there was to support people through what can be a really difficult time period for the dog, but also there for the caregiver too. And I also have a big question mark, Andy, around the new behaviours in adolescence. I don't think they're new. I think they're connected to things that we overlook during puppyhood, and the puppy's natural development patterns there may have not had such a spotlight or put such a spotlight on some of the behaviours that become more evident and more difficult for people to manage during that adolescent phase. For example, my best friend lives at our farm. He's a grandfather, and his grandson was in my arms when he was 6 months old. He could sit up. I've held him since he was born. So he's sitting up now in my arm, and he really liked coming out into my office. If you connect with dogs, you're a great environment for small kids too, because they're all, access to lots of colourful toys and interesting, safe environments to explore. So I was holding this delightful boy in my arm, and I was chatting to his parents and his grandfather, and I just felt his little shoulder just move, and he was leaning towards the door that goes out into the back garden where my office is, and he started to lean a bit more because I didn't respond. And I was like, following his lean, we ended up in my office. He obviously couldn't verbally communicate, but he was using his body position to indicate to me where he would like me to take him. We all observe leaning in dogs, the leaning away maybe when we reach out a hand, maybe the ducking of the head when we go to touch our dogs, maybe more evident where the dog fully moves away. But do we pay attention to this in puppies? I have to say, from my perspective, I missed it, or highly likely I missed it. And having been really acutely aware of this kind of leaning that was going on, that was so subtle, it wasn't a big throwing, it wasn't sort of the body weight backwards, it wasn't pointing, there was no vocalization, just this subtle shift of balance that I could feel in my arms. I was then with two people who are really gifted canine educators, and one of them had a puppy and said, would you like to hold the puppy? And I said, that's very lovely. Oh, no, it'd be really nice, puppy's really confident. And I just question mark, really, have we actually asked the puppy here? And I did put my hands out and I did hold the puppy, but I made sure I stayed really close to the familiar person and also the puppy's caregiver. And the puppy just started to air scent towards first caregiver, then familiar person, then back to caregiver, and I passed the puppy straight back because the puppy didn't air scent me. Puppy did not want to pick up my scent, would have already been aware of my scent. The puppy was seeking through really subtle body movements his place of known safety and familiarity. There was no struggling, the puppy wasn't rigid, the puppy wasn't shut down, the puppy was clearly indicating that he was seeking the familiar. And as soon as I passed the puppy back, he sort of melted back into his caregiver's arms. So I do wonder how much we miss this early communication, how we overload these amazing young companions by mistake. And going back to pulling, Andy, think about the movement pattern of a puppy versus the walking speed of a normal adult, or the normal walking speed of a normal adult household, but also where there may be children involved too. Everything's much faster than that puppy's movement. So are we, from a really early age, setting up pathways, movement pathways in our puppies that encourage them to move quickly, to keep up with us, to keep that in necessary engagement with us, that we then try and modify or change and get frustrated with as the puppy develops into an adolescent and their muscles are starting to develop and they now naturally outwalk us? Is this not something we have inadvertently reinforced from those puppies' early weeks, months with us as their caregiver? And also, how are we already shaping the way they engage with us through repetitive if you're right-handed, engagements just with that right hand, versus training us to be more aware of our habits by reaching out with our left hand. If we're raising puppies, putting their feed bowls in with the left hand, offering rewards from that left hand as we start to build that youngster's education. Because when we might think, for example, we're reinforcing a desired behavior from our perspective, but actually we're reinforcing more often than not crookedness, a twist in the tongue, a tilt in the head, as we start to add reward-based training. And this is, for me, where I really like to help people consider rewarding education rather than focused on reward-based training. So in rewarding education, for me, the focus is on income for the dog as opposed to outcome. And I think we need to be really careful around creating conflict with food. So the dog is engaging with us, not because he's necessarily enjoying that engagement, but because he's motivated to want to take that piece of treat or that piece of food that's on offer. So that's where, in part, free work has become a more structured way of enhancing rewarding education, enhancing sensory education for our dogs, because it also helps give the dog more choice, and it helps us to recognize that sometimes what we might consider rewarding from our perspective isn't actually that rewarding for the dog.
You know, so much of what you just said there is mind-blowing, I think, and especially for the listeners, I think, because this is the core of it, Sarah, which, you know, I've gone through a lot just by having the privilege of having Molly, and Kieran and I making the decision early on, as soon as she came to us, to do very little and to set her up to safe ways to do experimental environmental learning and do very little structured learning. And I think this is at the core. We just don't know enough yet about what we're potentially doing for some dogs, I think. And some of this stuff you're talking about with adolescents, where we know that you know, most social juvenile mammals, I guess, I don't know about any other sort of say, but that kind of teenage brain is kind of designed to dysregulate.
Yeah.
So it's and we put a lot of pressure on from an early age through structured training to self-regulate all the time. Yeah. And a lot of the education we think we're doing, you mentioned it just then, has very little value to the dog, actually, the stuff that we need. So how we have to trust that Mother Nature knows what she's doing regarding development for these young animals and what they need to learn and how they need to learn it in the right order. And I think learning from the pup first, we had the amazing Helen Moore on recently, and Lucy Alders and others who have come into the group who are looking at this differently, how they even formulate their puppy classes. You know, Matt down at South, Matt and Tam, of course, really embracing thinking about things differently. And we shouldn't be fearful of this. I think, you know, it's not a case of throwing out the window the conversations that you came and joined us with our Beyond the Operant chat. It is beyond, it's not instead of, it's just thinking about how we're putting these things into place. And if we are reinforcing behaviors, do they have any innate value or not? Because often they don't.
I want to scream and shout and jump through the screen and hug you, Andy. And what you were saying about trusting Mother Nature, nearly every adolescent dog that I've had the pleasure of learning from, either as a foster, from rescue, in rescue, as clients, have become body sensitive pretty well overnight around the 5-month age mark. And I've thought a lot about this. Is it to do with the growth plates and the bones of the long bones of the hind limbs growing faster than the soft tissue allows, and you know, the angles of the body changing through that rapid growth, and all of those are valid. Acid reflux is more common in adolescent dogs, and again, is that linked to sort of development of the nervous system, the central nervous system? Is it to do with the frame changing? And then I was also like, hang on a minute. Nature is so smart. Would there not be a potential element of a adolescent of any species needing to move beyond finding contact comfortable? Because if contact from the mother, the father, if you're in that kind of social group, siblings, if that was meeting that animal's needs, where would be the incentive to go out, seek a mate, seek a social group, seek new environments? Well, there wouldn't be any, would there? And you think adolescent humans were like, don't touch me. It's not just about peer pressure. It's driven by a biological need. So when we're then talking about variable rewards, so many adolescent dogs recall but hover. I see it in the young working dogs too. I have the privilege to connect with. Body contact is partly responsible for that, because people are well-intentioned, but I always think for dogs it must be like us living in the land of giant toddlers, well-intentioned, a little bit naughty, not very observant, and we're kind of like, hey, well done for coming back to me. But how punishing is that for a dog who's adolescent, who's body sensitive for all the reasons I mentioned, and who is potentially biologically programmed in that phase to not enjoy body contact at all? So I really am passionate about teaching a kind of almost hands-free approach. And again, that was one of the drivers for creating free work, because some of the things that I learned that I believed were going to be rewarding for dogs, when you actually stood back and watched the dogs, it wasn't rewarding at all. So again, it's like, let the dog be the pilot of his own body. Let him be the pilot of his own learning. And it's okay to be the co-pilot at times as well. Of course it is. I think we need to teach dogs how to feel safe in a crazy human world. But the more we step back and listen to them, the more we can strengthen that relationship. And particularly during adolescence, it's known that strong caregiver attachment reduces risk-taking behavior. And actually in humans that have weak caregiver attachment actually come into puberty earlier. So is that a potential in for some dogs as well? Highly likely, because actually our nervous system and our makeup's not actually that different from our canine companions. There's many parallels, as I know you know.
You know, every time we speak, Sarah, we've known each other a while. I'm always blown away. There's things you said there that have just made a few little things go off in my head, and I hadn't even, this thing about joining the dots, as you say, this is the beautiful thing, and allowing ourselves to have the freedom to think along those routes. We don't necessarily have to stop just because we don't necessarily know. I think the anecdotal has sadly been almost forced to the back seat at times, and it's a shame, because there is a truth there, even if it's the individual truth of that one individual animal in front of us. It doesn't have to be necessarily every dog does the same, but for you, I'm starting to feel that I know your truth a little bit more. And I think that's just a beautiful thing. Let's talk about ACE and free work then, because I'm going to say, Sarah, again, I love you, as you know, so it's no
I love you too.
secret there. So I have to say these kind of things, but you're so giving with what you do. You know, the ACE. Anybody who hasn't checked out ACE yet, I'll make sure there's a link in the comments here and in the group more generally. But it's such an amazing community you've built with ACE, and it is a community, because obviously you give your time to give your comments and that, but the community come together, and this is what's so beautiful, isn't it? And I think all these eyes on these animals to try and find out what their physical, emotional, or mental truth might be. It's a beautiful thing, and it was very much set up to kind of support a lot of the work you've done at Telefarm, but also the power of free work.
Yeah.
So just very briefly, if for those who don't know about free work, just give an idea of what it looks like.
Okay, the easiest way to describe it is kind of think of enrichment activities being made available to the dog on which further educational opportunities can be offered, but through your observation, shaping the layout and offering the right enrichment activities or sensory items to meet the needs of the dog. And that also means being flexible. So not finding one thing that the dog really enjoys today and then offering that repeatedly, because I don't want to read the same book over and over. I don't want to look at one news feed on Facebook over and over. I want to look at multiple news feeds. I want to read multiple books. I don't want to go to an art gallery and just look at one painting. I want to walk through lots of different rooms. So it's the same for dogs. I think we get trapped in, oh, we found something, let's keep repeating that. And although repetition is important and we like shortcuts, which is why everyone will cut across the corner of a junction and just like, hey, why did you do that? We're trying to shortcut all the time to speed up the engagement, leaving more room for novelty. But we need to be really mindful of that when we're engaged with our animals. We trap them in our habits. So for example, I used to have lots of people come with their dogs and I'd say, oh, while we're talking, set out some snuffle mats, for example. So this was kind of like really early days of free work. Oh, my dog doesn't enjoy that. But when we raised the snuffle mat, the dogs really enjoyed it. It was because it was too low on the ground. So physically, it may have put pressure on sore elbows, sore knees, sore hips, or emotionally, the dog didn't feel safe enough to have his nose on the ground. And the minute we started to raise those stations, not only was the dog that might be a little bit anxious able to enjoy truffling and rooting because it's triggering the seeking system, he could also keep his eyes on me, who may have been the less familiar person in the room, or kept looking around the environment, because obviously we often have people walking past windows at the farm with wheelbarrows, for example. Started to recognize the same with drinking. Having raised water bowls in the center of the room made things more accessible for a dog. Again, thinking, why do we put water against a wall? A dog has to put his head down, his hindquarters are exposed in a room where he actually can't see what's going on around him. And we're also saying, hey, is it really rewarding for you to take that drink and stare at a wall? When we're at a party and we might go to the drinks table to go and hold a drink, so we've got something to do. I think drinking is a really important social interaction for dogs, something again we overlook. Do we go and stand and stare at the wall? No, we have our back to the wall so we can keep our eyes on the room and look at the engagement and maybe see who's going to be a safe bet if we want to start to go and introduce ourselves to people. So I saw more dogs drinking. People still now say, I cannot believe my dog is drinking in this environment. I have traveled with my dog for years. It's always been a problem. My dog has never drunk in those environments. But it might be as simple as the dog not relaxing enough, or that water bowl was not in a place that enabled that dog to feel physically and or emotionally safe. And the two often go together. So lots of dogs, maybe with a working, like sort of some working types, perhaps, who may have an anxiety bias, are going to be way more sensitive potentially to how they feel on a physical level and not just on an emotional level. So free work is about meeting those needs and recognizing how we can encourage that dog to become the pilot of his own body, looking at movement patterns, looking at how that dog engages with that item and what happens after that engagement too. So does he pick up speed because he actually was tipping out of balance? Can he not stay engaged because actually he's trying to offload uncomfortable joints all the time? Do we see a right hind always popped out to the side actually, or maybe a left fore? So that's kind of free work in its simplest form, a beautiful exploration process for the dog, but an exploration process for us too. That wasn't short, was it, Andy?
It wasn't, but it's beautiful. And I think for me, there must be something as well for the dog on a very intrinsic level that they connect to that activity. Because one of the things when I first started seeing free work up at Tilly Farm, I'm always thinking processing, because that's my bias, right? Yeah. I think, how do we process the world around us? And I'd see these dogs come in. Quite often the caregiver would say, right, my dog's a little bit sensitive around people, so we'd all know not to kind of put any social pressure. So we'd all be kind of sat in a kind of circle or semicircle around the main area. The dog would come in, The dog's already done a bit of free work potentially, so it attaches the free work really well. And that notion that it knows that it can do things, that it has that kind of agency, that freedom of movement. And then what you'd see is every so often they'd go and do an activity, but they'd be also processing the room in a way. I use the doors of the brain analogy. So if you imagine the brain has lots of doors in it, we need as many doors to stay open for the animal to safely and calmly and rationally process what's going on. So there must be a way of, with free work, it seems to keep those doors open, because then you'll find the dog will suddenly shoot off, usually around the back of a few people, sniff their bottoms or sniff the back of their knees, and then come back into the safety of the free work. And that's why free work is something I use a lot with dogs who can struggle a bit processing guests into the house. Because we tend to want to go down a more of a structured counter conditioning route. And for me, we always have to be mindful about what is it we're countering and what is it we're actually creating, question mark again. But with free work, it gives the dogs chance to actually process in a way that they need to, and also the ability to go back to the activity and decompress and do those kind of things. So I think it's really powerful tool in many ways, actually, not just from an observational point of view, but to get those dogs into a good processing state.
I agree. And when we have our in-person events, you know, we've had several dog human partnerships that have come, and you know, people may say, oh, my dog, you know, will scan the horizon and can be a bit, you know, keen to chase. And I say, well, okay, let's just see how your dog moves, and let's see if we can help your dog kind of reset and relax and engage maybe the parasympathetic nervous system to simplify things, use his nose, start that sort of deep rhythmical breathing, start breathing through the nose instead of breathing through the mouth. And we can help you observe when those postural shifts occur that might indicate that arousal arc is starting. What we find is then people start to identify that, let's say after engagement with a licky station, I might say a licky max, I use lots of different textures to really increase the sensory experience for the dog's tongue, looking at how the dog moves his tongue. Can the dog use his tongue? We might see the ears that were up high actually start to soften, and the area, as my friend Sarah Whitman and I call it, starts to widen, and that tail starts to drop, and the footfall becomes lighter and more rhythmic. We know that engagement with that station is a potential great reset, which can then be taken out into the outside world as a portable reset. We might do one session in the morning, one session in the afternoon. Then these dogs, and it didn't matter whether they were sensitive to the sight of other dogs or sensitive to the sound of wildlife or sensitive to the movement of wildlife or the sound of birds fighting in the fields during, you know, pheasant mating season. It didn't matter what triggers they were that they'd had, they were all floating with their guardian on a loose line. Once equipment had been put back on the dogs, we start with the dog completely naked, for want of a better word possible, and able just to walk outside and just stand air scenting for the first time with this beautiful soft ear carriage, this soft tail carriage. And these are dogs that have practiced those hypervigilant behaviors for years, but in 1-2 sessions we're able to influence the brain so that they're more thoughtful and less reflexive in their behavior. So I think there are many layers to free work, but also I think what's hugely powerful, Andy, is again, it keeps our question marks. For example, sometimes we'll have a ball pit that was inspired by one of my great life companions and tutors, Cookie Dough Dynamo, 14 years ago. We might have that in there. We'll change the setup depending if the dog's worried about noise. We might have a snuffle tray to start with, mini pocket snuffle mats, and then add one ball perhaps and build the noise gradually over time. But lots of caregivers say, my dog will grab the ball, my dog's ball obsessed, question mark. Dogs come in, they're exploring, they look at the ball, nothing, the guardians are like, and I say your dog is unlikely to respond in the way you think your dog will respond, because we've set the environment in a completely different way. We're giving the nervous system hopefully peaceful and rewarding new experiences. So the dogs will explore and move, and we're looking at the quality of movement and the pattern and the direction of the movement. looking at all these things, looking at the coat patterns, how does that correlate with what we're seeing with the position of the ears and the tail and the legs? What's happening with the breathing? Is the dog only breathing through the abdomen, or is that beautiful rib cage able to expand and contract as well? What's happening through the back? All these amazing things. Dog still checking out the balls, carrying on, moving towards the snuffle mat station that's raised, for example. Then sometimes a noise might happen. A wind might get up and cladding might knock against the arena wall. At that point, some of these dogs have run and grabbed the ball. Then they've released it. Or when the caregiver starts to sit within that framework of free work and the dog starts to maybe just come and hang out, one caregiver recognized that her dog, as she extended her hand, had to run and grab that ball that the dog was obsessed with. It was like a switch going on and off, Andy. And she said, my dog's not ball obsessed. My dog picks up a ball when I try to touch him. Yes. And the other caregiver was saying, my gosh, I thought my dog loved a ball because my dog loves to carry a ball when I take my dog to work every day. And this experience has made me question whether my dog enjoys going to work and has to carry a ball in order to deal with the sensory input from the environments I'm putting my dogs in. So I get, again, for me, it's that reframing, that revisiting our beliefs, our understanding, because everything we would want to know about a dog's story is there right in front of us, but we just need to recognize what it is they're trying to say. Yeah. And I, keep coming back to question everything, but never question the dog, because the dog is always right.
And I think the big thing that from those examples is, and I think this is what I find with caregivers, whether it's using free work or whether it's even just, I was out with a collie recently, and the caregiver thought the dog really loved the ball. It's a really good example. This comparison is important, because we actually went somewhere very quiet. We didn't have the ball. We went to these orchards. There's nobody else about. Oh, we had the dog on a lovely harness with a long line and just let the dog get into moochie mode. And then about 30 minutes in, we took the dog off the long line, and the dog instantly redirected back to the caregivers and said, where's the ball? Because the dog had made a connection between ball and being out. And I think for me, showing caregivers, and especially with the examples you showed there, and I think one of the dogs I saw at Tilly Farm, the person said, oh yeah, the dog's going to go straight for the toys, and the dog didn't, because the dog's able to process now, in processing mode. It's a bit like us doing a little bit of meditation or mindfulness and allowing ourselves to be in the moment and allow the sensory integrating process to work properly. Because the reality is, for many of our dogs, they spend a lot of time in a high elevated state. Yeah. So they reach for things, I talk about relief a lot, as you know, and I think a lot of dogs seek temporary relief in these things. But things like free work and just slowing things down more generally gives them a chance to reconnect to the environment and process differently. And especially when you've got a reactive dog, I don't like that term, as you know, but sensitive dog is how I like to see it. But when I've shown clients their dog doing free work and how they connect to things, and they see their dog in that state, they then have a comparison to what they see when they're just, as soon as that dog's on the walk, they're already elevated, right? Before they even see the other dog or anything else. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about free work and ACE more generally. It's given people comparisons, and all these wonderful caregivers who share their dogs' videos and images on ACE connections. It's the most wonderful learning journey for everybody, isn't it? Now?
It is. It really, really is. And I think what you were saying is so important, of finding that baseline, but also recognizing that for some of these dogs, their nervous system may never have experienced relaxation before. So we're opening up that possibility for them. And that's what free work is. It's about possibilities for me. And when Cookie Dough was first with me, I was her 4th or 5th foster home. She'd been signed over to Battersea when she was about 20 weeks old, and she found the whole world just utterly overwhelming. She was on sensory overload, and I fell into the trap of keeping her engaged. And I realized, fortunately, really quickly, I had taught her lots of useful skills because she wasn't attaching herself to my neck with her teeth. But I hadn't given her nervous system the experience of just being. And one simple hopefully simple experience for people to start exploring that sensation is to just sit with a dog when you know that's his quiet time, because dogs have natural rhythms to their days like we do. So, you know, don't force it at all. It's not about having the dog down on a cue at all. It's about that dog, meeting that dog in his natural, more relaxed time, and just sit with him. Don't read, don't have the television on, don't have your iPad or your phone. Just sit and watch his breathing. Watch what parts of his body move as he goes into REM sleep. Do you ever see him in REM sleep? And how do you feel as you start to connect with your dog in this hopefully really peaceful moment? And then giving you that baseline of when your feelings in the company of your dog start to change. Because if you share your life with a dog who finds the world challenging, it can increase anxiety in us so fast, we too forget what it's like to feel at peace with our amazing companions. So we need to remind our own nervous system of that possibility, even if we can only find it for a short moment. And I know when I just see that dog for one moment, just take that air and blink and take that breath and maybe walk in poetic movement for one stride, I know we can get it again and again and again, because we've opened up that door of possibility for that being, for that dog's nervous system, and for that guardian as well. And that to me is just the magical part of what we do.
And it is magical. And I think, again, you've described really well there a little window of thinking about how this process looks. Because I think from my point of view, especially talking about the things I've talked about and all the wonderful people like yourself who have gifted their time to come and talk in the group, it does come down to having the opportunity to slow down and do those observations and inviting the caregiver with you on that journey, because it can be a bit scary. A lot of us have started off by being influenced by a heavy operant model, because we've all of us been conditioned in a way just from the moment we're born. Amber Batson shared with me a story a little while ago about she was out with her little a very young, I don't know, like literally weeks old baby. And this lady came up to her and said, is it a good baby? You know, as in, and so we are already conditioned to this good, bad, reward,
wrong, right
kind of thing. Yeah. So it takes a lot to kind of let go of that. And so I get that. But actually, by starting by listening from the dog, as you say, always questioning everything, but not the dog, is the place to start. We build those layers from there. And it's very important. And again, this is another big important why free work is such an important tool, because for me, especially for those caregivers who are a bit stuck, because we can get stuck sometimes in our
absolutely
worldview.
I've been there. I got stuck with cookie dough 100%.
And we can all have that. And I think this is the thing with free work, it gives you the chance to see the dog in a different state and to kind of look at things in a different way. I think it's really important. Well, we've had our hour, Sarah, which is amazing. It just flew by, of course. Thank you for speaking to us today. And again, I just want to say publicly thank you again for all the support you've offered me over the years we've known each other. And it's always been amazing whenever we get together and talk about stuff, because so many light bulbs go off for me. And it's also very validating and reaffirming, I think, for many people listening now as well. Because what I love about the dog-centered care community is that a lot of people have come together who have been thinking a little bit differently or wanting to have different perspectives. And our community hasn't always been the best place to think differently, and I think there is changes to that now. I think which is an exciting time.
I love what you're doing. I love everything about you, Andy. What you're doing and in creating that safe space for people.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's what it is. It is a safe space. I think that's a good way of putting it. So if people want to find out more about Sarah, then find out more about your courses, what have you got coming up, and where's the best place to go and find things so they can see you speak or come to see you or go on your courses and that kind of thing?
Go to the website tillyfarm with an E, tillyfarm.org.uk. We've got a list of the courses online that are available. Some come with practical in-person workshops. But I need to put more dates up for the new courses that we're putting together, and those should be up in the next few weeks. Looking forward to the quietening around the next month or so to be able to update the website. So check out Ace Connections as well if you're not already a member. That's another really safe place with amazing members, and ultimately it's the members that make that space a safe place to be, isn't it? So
and it is an amazing space, because I know myself, with Dogs Until, we've got an amazing community, but sometimes there's a little bit of work behind the scenes just to kind of keep things on track. I'm sure there is with Ace Connections, but from an outsider looking in, it is the most important. I think we just attract the right people, I guess, because people are thinking in this way. But I love how so many question marks are put on those things. And what I love about how you educate, Sarah, is this openness to have a view, because sometimes when you go to an educational experience, you're very much being told this is what you need to do, or this is how you need to see it. But your style is very different to that, of course. And as you say, you work just as much about seeing the dog in front of you. You also see the person in front of you and meet them where they are.
Thank you. It's really important for me to do that, because none of us are born with knowledge, and we have a culture of being right or feeling stupid if we're wrong. And that just doesn't apply. We're all learning all the time. And I tell people, you are going to make mistakes, but I call them MISS takes, mistakes, because we all miss things. We do. That's just a normal part of education. And the other thing I really hope we support people through is the feeling of guilt, because as we start to learn more, I think we look back and feel that we need to apologize. But I would want to say to anybody that feels that that's also an unavoidable part of learning. I can absolutely relate to that, especially given that my animal guardianship stretches back to, from the age of 4, when we welcomed smaller animals into our home. But I just think that any animal that shares their life and is there to educate people who want to keep learning and keep asking questions is very blessed to be with that person. So.
And funny said, because I have, I see a regular therapist, because I think it's important in our job that we have a chance to have supervision and talk about things. I'd recommend anybody, you don't have to feel you have any emotional need to. I think it's a good chance to offload. But she says to me often, guilt is a sign of something learned. And I think that is exactly what you're saying there. And I think, well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate your time in the group today, and have a wonderful Christmas. Same to everybody else. This is the last live chat with a guest this side of the new year. But if you wanted to come and join me on the 30th of December, it's just gonna be me, and I'm just gonna share with you some thoughts on dog centre care and where we've been over this last year, and also very excitingly announce my little virtual workshops that I'm going to be starting in January. So anybody who's interested in unpacking this more and looking to challenge ourselves to think more differently about how we see behavior for ourselves, and also how we judge the behavior in others, because these are really intrinsic for us when we start thinking about looking in a different way. So 30th of December, if you want to come along and join me. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. Have a wonderful Christmas.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.